Hello and welcome to the club of delusional people pretending that it's spring already. I don't care that it's still cold outside. I have a cute little mug with little tulips on them, and I have a dress on with puffy sleeves, so that means I am allowed to frolic through a meadow and have a picnic while reading some books. Anyway, today we are going to be discussing the books that I recently read. There's a bunch of them. I feel like this month, or the past 1.5 months, has kind of fallen into the category of me either reading really like shitty books that the internet recommended to me, really fun, exceptionally just enjoyable fantasy books. Oh my god, I'm in such a high fantasy phase again. And then also really interesting non-fiction that I want to share with you. Before we start talking about this horrible book that I read because TikTok told me so, let's talk about something good, okay? I'm here to recommend good books to you. Let's start with a fantasy series that single-handedly pulled me out of my reading slump, like pulled me out of the trenches. I was coming out like drenched in mud because I've just been sitting around sifting in the trenches of a reading slump for so long, and this book just like picked me up and made me clean again and very, very happy. That was a weird metaphor. It is the Shepherd King series with One Dark Window as its first book and Two Twisted Crowns as the second and last book in this duology. It is an adult duology, but it feels kind of between young adult and adult in. We mainly follow this girl named Rachel. No, that's the author's name. We follow a girl named Elspeth. That's more of a fantasy name. And she has this monster living inside of her that's kind of slowly taking over, but she can also tap into its magic. That in itself is an amazing concept, but this is aided by a very fun storyline where we are in this small little village that is surrounded by creepy mists and creepy trees. You know, I love those two things. And if you go into it, you die. So our main character Elspeth kind of joins this group of like underground rogue people that are trying to get rid of the mist. There's a very cool magic system with playing cards, and each card gives you a different ability. It's very fun. This is one of those rare series where the second book is even better than the first book. If you're reading the first book and you're like, wow, this is so cool. Wow, I really wonder what's going on with these side characters. Ooh, this is such a little extra little detail. I'm really wondering about that. The second book, the author will go into all of those things and be like, I heard you the first time. Don't worry, second book will touch on all of those things. Fantastic. I don't want to hype these books up too much because it's just one of those series where you're like, I know it's not perfect. I just really love it. Like, it has a very, very simple storyline. The world building is super minimalistic. It kind of reminds me of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Okay. Every time I make a comparison to Avatar: The Last Airbender, I don't want to get your hopes up too much. I just mean in the sense that it has very simple world building. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's just like, well, there's 4 nations and there's 4 elements, and that's kind of what everything is built around. It's not very complex. It's the same thing with this series. You just have this one little tiny little town, and then there's 12 different playing cards, and they all give you a different power, and that's kind of it. And that's what everything is built around. If you want epic fantasy, if you want long lists of characters, a whole glossary of terms that you don't understand, very complex magic systems and world buildings, you're not gonna find that in this series. It's very simple, but I'd like that because sometimes you just need something simple to build something that's just so fun. Another thing that I really like about this series is that it has exceptional romance subplot lines, perfectly the way I like it, where it's the subplot, it never takes over the main storyline. It's not romantasy in any way, but it's just really good. It's the kind of romance where you just understand why the two characters are really into each other. You know how sometimes when authors write a second book, it's like, okay, the characters came together in the first book. Well, there's a second book, so we're just gonna throw in some annoying conflict. That doesn't happen in this series. I can't say why. Yeah, the plot isn't super complex. All the plot twists were very predictable. There's quite a few plot holes, but I still recommend this if you want like an easy to get in fantasy. If you like your fantasy with just like a little bit of like a darker aesthetic and you just want it to be like fun, engaging, action-packed, morally gray main character, it's got it all. I think this series has one of my new favorite characters, and that is Prince Elm. One of my favorite like character archetypes are these like very charming prince-like characters that have kind of like a hidden dark side. And the more you learn about the characters, you know, the more like a sadness they have to them. Oh, that pulls on my heartstrings. And it's even better if they fall in love with like kind of like a grumpy woman. Hateful, deceitful woman. It happens in this series, and coincidentally it happens in another series that I also read the past few months that I also really enjoyed, and that is that I read The Prisoner's Throne by Holly Black. This is the sequel to The Stolen Heir by Holly Black. To avoid spoilers, I'll just talk about like the series as a whole and whether I would recommend it. So this series is kind of a continuation of the Cruel Prince trilogy, and after having read The Prisoner's Throne, I do recommend that you read this after you've read the Cruel Prince trilogy, because especially in the second book, The Prisoner's Throne, we get a lot of characters from the original Cruel Prince trilogy. And if you don't care about these characters, like if you've never really gotten to see them in action in the original trilogy, you're not gonna care about them in this book. So that's why. This is kind of an odd sequel because The Stolen Heir is very different to the Cruel Prince series, as in it is like a quest storyline. We follow Suren, this main character, who's this kind of like monstrous fae girl. She's like a wild girl that grew up in a forest, and it's a quest storyline. It has a very different feel from the Cruel Prince. And then in its sequel, not only do we only follow Oak, Prince Oak. This book is completely Suren's perspective. This book completely Oak's perspective. The prince of the fairy kingdom. But the whole vibe of the story is completely different. It kind of feels like Holly Black listened to people being disappointed in The Stolen Heir because people were kind of expecting it to be like The Cruel Prince, and then it wasn't. I think this book was good on its own. Like, you shouldn't expect another Cruel Prince, but a lot of people said that. It kind of felt like Holly Black listened to that and was like, okay, well, the second book, we're gonna be doing it more like The Cruel Prince. Jude and Carden, the main characters from The Cruel Prince, play a big role in this one suddenly. It is no longer really an adventure quest story the way this book was, and instead mostly focuses on political intrigue the way The Cruel Prince was as well. So I would say, like, vibe-wise, this book feels more like another Cruel Prince, which is good. It's just kind of weird that it's so different in the type of story that The Stolen Heir was. So it feels weird as a sequel. I think I would have preferred if Holly Black was just like, well, this series is different from The Cruel Prince. It's more of an adventure story. It's just a different kind of story, and just stick to that. But instead, it kind of felt now that between the first book and the second book, there's this weird pivot to make it more like The Cruel Prince. That being said, I really liked this book. Holly Black is just so amazing at creating an engaging plot line with so many twists and turns and betrayals. I love her fairy world that is always like quite dark for what you would expect for a young adult book. There's a lot of stabbing, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of dark things happening, which I really like. And I think Oak is such an interesting main character. Again, we have the archetype of this princely, charming character that has kind of like a darker side to him. Oh, and the romance between him and Suren, that's not a spoiler. It's like clear from the beginning that that's gonna happen, is also this charming prince falling in love with this like monstrous disaster fairy. It's great. Holly Black's fairy stories will always be my favorite type of fairy stories. It's ones where the fairies have teeth, you know? And speaking of going to a different fantasy world to escape, another way that I love a little bit of escapism in my life is playing video games, and that's why I love that this video is sponsored by G2A. They are a huge online marketplace for digital products and games. On their website you can find exactly which discounts for which games are available in your area. Whether you play on your PC or on your Switch or on a PlayStation, you can find something for everything. So for example, if you're looking for expansion packs, there's a lot of them that you can find on G2A for a discount. I will leave the link in the description so you can check them out. And then the last fantasy book that I finally read, The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. I read this for my Patreon book club. I love this author's other book, The Night Circus. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and I've kind of been putting off her other book because I was like, I want to love it, you know, I'm probably gonna love it, so I need to be mentally in the best possible place to read it. Just me putting random pressure on myself for reading a book. But now I finally read it. What do I think of this? I still don't know. The Starless Sea is an ode to stories, and we follow a main character, Zachary, that kind of gets roped into this underground dark academia cult club by going through a magical door. It really is more the main character experiencing things. The book kind of feels like you're playing a video game, you know, and you're just experiencing this world and the little puzzles and all the little details, because that is Erin Morgenstern's strength. It's just giving you these amazing descriptions of rooms with keys and dice and living doll houses and personified moons in inns and vast magical libraries. Just like The Night Circus, this book is not plot based, it's purely vibe based. And the vibes in this book are stories. It's a story about stories, an ode to stories, because you don't just follow Zachary's plotline, you also read the books he reads in the book. It will be a story within a story within a story. In The Night Circus, I loved the vibes. I was there for the vibes. I didn't mind that there was no plot or intricate characterization. With this one, I did struggle. And I think it's because I just had a really tough time getting myself to care about anything. In A Night Circus, there's like this love story that, even though, you know, maybe there's not a lot of characterization, there's tension. There's something to keep you reading. There's a little bit more intrigue. But with this book, I just so didn't care about these characters, and they're constantly in danger, and I'm like, I kind of don't care. With this book, you have to do a little bit of puzzling, but I really felt like every little detail that happened had some kind of meaning that I was missing, which made the story not fun to read. When I talked about this book with my Patreon book club, the people that enjoyed it the most were the people that just kind of let it happen to them, and the people that were trying too much to understand everything or be like, but what does that mean, and what does this mean, and why did that happen, and how did that work, those are the people that end up not really enjoying it. So that is my tip if you're going to be reading this book, because I do really appreciate this book for what it is. It really is an ode to stories and how stories are constantly changing, but also always kind of a little bit similar. It's beautifully written. I just didn't really care sometimes. I feel like this is a book where I'm gonna change my opinion on it the longer it sits with me. So those were my little escapist fantasy books that I read. Okay, let's talk about a horrible book. I don't know why I read this. I think part of me thought that it could be funny. Another part of me thought I could maybe, you know, enjoy it a little, just kind of like turn your brain off kind of romance novel. None of those two things happened. The Fine Print by Lauren Escher. This is like a really thick 450-page romance book that is very, very popular. The concept of this book is that Rowan is the director of Dreamland, which is basically Disneyland. He owns Disneyland. Okay, Dreamland, it's Disneyland. And he's super duper rich, and he falls in love with one of his employees, Zara, who works at Dreamland. And she gets offered like this high position job under him to work together on like a roller coaster ride. And I was like, okay, that sounds bad. I'm gonna read that. I think it'll be fun. I did not know that what I was in for was... Sorry, I'm distracted by a huge bee in front of my window. Okay, sorry. What I didn't know I was getting was basically like Jeff Bezos / exploited Amazon employee fanfiction. You know how romance books always have like a central point of conflict. If it's enemies to lovers, there's something they disagree on, and then one of them has to become a better person, or they learn from each other. You can do all sorts of interesting things with that, but you know, it's always there for the romance. In this book, this central conflict is the fact that he, Rowan, is this evil billionaire that exploits his employees, doesn't give them healthcare, doesn't pay them enough. You know, very, very real world serious problems. And the love interest, Zara, is his employee that suffers from the low wages and the lack of healthcare. And through dating, he learns to not treat his employees like dog garbage. I just can't believe that this is the plot of a romance book. And what makes it even worse is that the book tries to pull a both sides thing, where Zara also learns that actually Rowan's life is really miserable and sad because he's so rich. I get it, you know, there's two sides to both stories. On the one hand, people are starving, dying, working themselves overtime because they don't have enough healthcare, they don't get enough money. I get that. And then on the other hand, you have someone who gets a little lonely sometimes. You know, it all evens out. It all evens out, and we should all have empathy for each other. I'm so sorry. I do understand why this is so popular. The boss employee thing, it's very like grumpy sunshine, like she fixes him basically. That's what the story is. I get why people love it. I didn't. I really tried and I couldn't. So I am in the process of making like a full spoiler video, just kind of going through it, because I'm sure there are many of you who would love for me to just talk about all the things that happen in the book so you don't have to read it yourself. So don't worry, video like that is coming and I am excited about that. And if you are too, make sure you subscribe if you're not already, or just look out for it. I don't know. Self-promo. I did finish it in 3 days, so do with that knowledge what you will. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk about some super interesting nonfiction books. For those of you who are a little bit new, I really enjoy nonfiction books as well. I think the past year I haven't really been reading them, but this year I've been getting back into the swing of things. I personally really love listening to nonfiction books on audiobook because it just kind of feels like you're listening to a really long podcast. I spend a lot of my free time listening to podcasts, but sometimes I like to switch it up with a nonfiction book and it feels more like a podcast, because if I'm listening to like a fantasy book, I feel like I really have to pay attention to visualize everything when you're listening to the audiobook, and that's not always something you want to do when you're like scrubbing the dirt of a plate while you're doing the dishes. So then nonfiction is actually really fun and super interesting because there are so many super interesting things to learn about. My favorite nonfiction book that I listened to the past 2 months was Word Slut by Amanda Montell. She is the one who also wrote Cultish, which was one of my favorite books of last year. She is a linguist, so she writes books about linguistics, and I love linguistics. I don't know anything about it, but it's one of those things where I can just soak up endless amount of random fun little facts. I love fun little facts about linguistics. So Word Slut is a book about linguistics, but specifically focusing on the meeting point between feminism and linguistics, and how our language shapes the way we think about feminism, shapes the way we think about women, or reflects the way that we think about women. Okay, before I give you some examples of like my favorite little facts that I learned from this book, I would highly recommend this if you are interested in feminism and linguistics. Obviously, I do wonder a little bit about like who the target audience of this book is, because I don't think anyone who is like sexist or not interested in feminism at all would pick up a book about feminism. Like, I think if you pick up a book like this, you're probably already a little bit into feminism. But a lot of, especially the earlier chapters, are very, very introductory feminist stuff. Like the stuff that you would say to someone who is not yet feminist. But I don't think people like that would be picking this book up. I don't know, maybe I'm making the wrong assumptions, but sometimes I really felt like this book kind of underestimated the type of people that would probably be reading it. Anyway, here are some fun, the most like interesting little things that stuck with me while reading this book. One of the main things that this book goes into is how a lot of the speech patterns that women have, we tend to kind of look down upon, like vocal fry or uptalk, the way women often, well, we have the idea that women are often the people that end their sentences kind of like their question. They kind of talk like this. Or things like over apologizing, or always using words like in their sentences, and we tend to kind of look down on that. And oftentimes there's like feminist advice towards women that are like, stop talking like that and sound more like a man, and that is somehow feminism. And this book really goes into showing that, first of all, a lot of these like womanly speech patterns aren't actually things that women use. We just think it's just women using them, but men use them too. And secondly, we tend to like wrongfully assume that they come from not having confidence, or kind of like girliness or non-dominance, when in reality every single little of these speech patterns have their own function. For example, she goes into all the ways the word like actually serves like a linguistic function within a sentence. Or for example, the common complaint that women over apologize too much and are more likely to constantly be like, I think, maybe, but I'm not sure, I'm just checking in, you know, that kind of like talking. We tend to assume that it just comes from not having enough confidence, when in reality these are all speech patterns that help conversation. They help creating social cohesion. They help creating an even playing ground for everyone to give their opinion, making sure no one appears too dominant, which is actually a good thing, but we just look down on it because we associate it with women and therefore assume that it must come from some kind of lack of confidence, and we should teach women to not speak like that, when in reality it has a function. Loved that part of the book. And then another thing that I really want to share that really stuck with me is she went into how this idea of no means no is actually counteractive. A common thing that we teach people is the concept of no means no, aka, you know, if a woman tells you no, you shouldn't try to continue. It's like one of these sentences that we use to kind of try to counteract harassment and assault. No means no. But Amanda Montell really interestingly goes into how linguistically this is actually counteractive, because most of the time when people reject, or at least in the English language, when people give a rejection, they don't use the word no. Like if you linguistically analyze rejections, most of the time it forms a pattern along the lines of, I'm sorry, but I actually have other plans. Or, I'm afraid I won't be able to make it. Like a lot of rejections never use the word no, and by constantly giving this message of like no means no, we are actually putting responsibility on women to be saying no, when in reality people in English tend to be a little softer in their rejections, and instead we should be putting the responsibility on others to understand when someone's rejecting them. And if we keep saying no means no, it actually really opens the door for harassers to be like, well, she didn't technically say no, so, you know, when it's their responsibility to have the empathy to understand when they're being politely rejected. Interesting. That stuck with me. Okay. That's my little linguistic lesson for now. I have also been reading Susan Sontag's essays. This is the essay collection Against Interpretation and Other Essays, and I read the essay Against Interpretation that I kind of want to briefly touch upon, because why wait until I finish the book to talk about all the essays when I can just talk about each essay when I read one. If you want to change the way that you look at art, at film, at literature, read Against Interpretation. Basically, her point in this essay, and I can never fully give you like the full impact of the essay by telling you what it's about. You have to read it for yourself. But her main point nowadays, and this was written in like the 60s, 70s, or 80s, we are too focused on trying to find like the hidden meaning in every piece of art. We're too focused on just the contents and like deciphering what the real meaning is of a piece of art, and this hidden meaning is then considered the real meaning, and that is how we should appraise art and experience art, by looking at the hidden meanings. And Susan Sontag argues that we should stop only focusing on that and instead return to just how a piece of art is experienced the way it is, in its form, in like the paint that you see, the thickness of the paint, the colors, the music, the visuals of a film when you're in the cinema, and how you're experiencing it, the way the piece of art just is without interpreting it, but by directly experiencing it. That is also something very valuable, and we should focus on that a little bit more when we're appraising art. And I think she makes a wonderful point with that. Maybe I can share a quote. I made a lot of notes. She has some banger quotes here that really impacted me. Like, for example, here she says about interpretation. Interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. How she's referring to our intellect as something that takes revenge on art. Beautiful. She calls interpretation a mass ravishment of art. It excavates, it destroys art. Interpretation takes the sensory experience of the work of art for granted, and she argues that we should focus more on the sensory experience of a piece of art. The only thing that either she isn't sure about yet, or I just didn't understand yet, is how this would relate to appraising literature. Like, when you're reading a book, how can you focus on like the sensory experience of the art? There's no like thickness and color of paint you can look at. You only have like the feeling of the pages in your hands. But that's kind of similar for every book. So that is something I'm still thinking about. Like, how would you appraise a novel based on the sensory experience of the form of the book? So if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. But yeah, highly recommend. Can't wait to read more of her essays. And then the last book that I read, I will go through super quickly because it's a Dutch, very short audiobook. I'm not sure if it has a translation. It is Eigen, welzijn, eerst by Roxane van Iperen, which translates to putting your own welfare first. At first I thought this was going to be like a self-help book. When I saw the title, I was like, oh, that's just some self-help book. But the point is that it is about how more and more in the past like decades, the middle class has started to focus on their own well-being first, and people are starting to focus way more on just themselves and getting themselves in order instead of focusing on the well-being of the collective. And how it is kind of contradictory that when we live in a world where the rich people are getting richer and richer, you would think that maybe the middle class would be more focused on, you know, general welfare, helping people who have a harder time, but instead it seems that a lot of people in the middle class are becoming more and more conservative and focused on saving themselves. And she goes into why that is, the influence of like the COVID crisis, the influence of just the general inequality crisis that we're in right now. Very interesting, highly recommend. She puts a lot of focus also on how influencers and like specifically those like welfare, cottagecore, homesteading influencers are like directly related to like conspiracy theorist QAnon kind of stuff. If you're Dutch and you want to kind of be up to date with like the current politics, highly recommend. Super short, like 2.5 hours audiobook. Okay, let me know what your favorite book was that you read the past month. I'm still in my fairy vibe. The next book I will be reading is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is also going to be the book club for my Patreon this month, so if you want to become a patron and join the book club for this book, link will be in the description. I'm just so excited about reading. I love when the sun shines in the morning and I can read while having breakfast and the sun is shining in my room and I have my cute little mug to drink my tea. I need very simple things to be happy. I want to end this video by giving a big thank you to my patrons, with a special shout out to my elite Patreon members. And welcome to our newest elite members, Anya Repinetskaya and Fritz the Gnome. Welcome. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon with another video next week. Goodbye.